All right. So this is the Duty to Warn vidcast, and I'm your host, John Gartner, and I'm speaking today to Harper West. She's a psychotherapist in Clarkston, Michigan. She graduated from Michigan State and the Michigan School of Professional Psychology. She's developed a mode of therapy that she calls self-acceptance therapy, and recently she wrote a chapter for the upcoming book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, with the intriguing title, In Relationship with an Abusive President. I love that title. I think that very much captures many of our experience. Could you say more about how we're in a relationship with an abusive president? What is this abusive relationship that we're all suffering from right now?
Certainly, yeah. I draw parallels in the chapter
Yeah,
between Trump and an abusive type of personality.
yeah.
And I first want to just say, John, thanks for all your work on Duty to Warn and the Yale conference and all the efforts that
Oh,
you've
you're
put
welcome.
forward on the
Thank
book and
you.
all these things. It's been a pleasure to know that there are like-minded souls out there in this difficult
I
time.
understand.
So, so I talk about how there's common personality traits between someone like Trump, the sort of authoritarian personality, and those who've been involved in domestic violence perpetration, and that's really a common thing that I talk about and I identify a few key behaviors, but there are many that are similar. And certainly, we've all been familiar with his lying, his deception, his again authoritarian bragging and bullying. These are all very common in people who perpetrate domestic violence and abuse. So that's a brief summary of what I talk about. But they're all basically driven by very common human needs and emotions. And so there may be differences, slight differences in the behavior, but the underlying behavior and emotions are the same.
You say abusers are other blamers, you call them, right? That's a
Yes.
term that you've come up with. Can you tell us what an other blamer is, where that comes from, and why these people are dangerous?
Certainly, yeah. That's a name that I've kind of coined with my self-acceptance psychology concept, and it sort of encompasses a lot of these, descriptions that we've used with Trump that are in psychology, like malignant narcissist and narcissistic personality disorder. And the name sort of encompasses what they tend to do when they feel an experience of shame. They tend to blame others or offload that shame. Externalizing shame is another phrase that is used a lot with this type of personality. They don't want to experience shame, so they are doing all these coping skills, unhealthy coping skills, to try to offload that onto other people. And blaming others, as Trump has done and others do, is one of those key behaviors that they do. And I see this all as sort of a shame management strategy. It's not a very healthy one, but it's a shame management strategy. And there are others. There are people who self-blame. I call them self-blamers, the tendency to lash in at the self or to just blame, avoid blame altogether. So, but these externalizing, blaming behaviors that sort of lash out at others is kind of a core construct with Trump and with abusers. And there's a lot more on my website, which is harperwest.co, on all the characteristics of these other blamers. But if you look in the DSM with, narcissistic behaviors and those kind of things, it's the same sorts of behaviors.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned that this has had an effect on your patients. Can you say what effect it's had on your patients?
Yes, certainly. We see a lot of people who've been, traumatized, and Betty Tang talked about this in your other video, that certainly re-traumatized if they've been in abusive relationships. And I can speak from personal experience because I was in an abusive marriage briefly many years ago before I was a psychologist. And so I, was also traumatized in this way. And I think for me, it's this other blamer personality has a couple key characteristics that really viscerally trigger fear response in other people who've been victimized in the past by them. Because of this tendency to offload blame on others, obviously it's a tendency for the victim or the sufferer on the other end to accept that blame. And I think for me, there's also a core construct with this type of personality where they cannot be empathic to others, and we've talked about that in regard to Trump and those type of personalities, that they lack a sense of remorse or empathy for others, and I think we all viscerally understand that, right? We all in a relationship know when somebody cares about us or doesn't care about us. We'll do what is right in the relationship or not. And some of us who've been in abusive relationships can spot that right away. We are triggered right away when we see this person isn't out for my best interest, and that is was really triggering for me with Trump and other people as well.
And what's the effect of that triggering? How does that manifest itself?
Well, it's a good question. I think it varies for a lot of people. For many people, it's just this sense of anxiety, right? A sense of just discontent of there's something wrong. There's a fear. It triggers that fear response that many of us experience when we're in relationship with an abusive or authoritarian type of person, and it tells us there's something to be afraid of. And we may not even be able to express that in a way that's coherent, but it's just a sense we're triggered and threatened, and we want to get away. We want to flee. So, yeah.
So why do you feel as a therapist that you have needed to speak out about Donald Trump? Why do you feel a duty to warn?
Well, again, I think it's for me a very personal experience because of my experience in abusive relationships of various types. I have a deep need, and that's one of the reasons I became a psychologist, was to try to help people, educate them on this type of personality, quite frankly. Certainly, I was too submissive, and others are too submissive and engage in relationships in unhealthy ways. But this other blaming type of personality is really obviously very toxic and dysfunctional in relationships. And I have a strong desire to educate people about that so that they can avoid this type of behavior in their interpersonal lives. So then when I saw it coming up in a potential leader, when he was running, in the primaries, it was deeply distressing because I thought, how can this be? We have an abusive person, an authoritarian figure rising to a level of leadership that is just, frightening to me. Given that I could see these very distinct parallels between abusive perpetrators and Trump. And so that was when I really got involved and campaigned and have written and blogged about it and gotten involved in many ways.
And all 300 million of us can't flee to the battered women's shelter.
Right, exactly. Yeah, in an abusive relationship, at least we have the opportunity to leave, right? It may be difficult for some people, but there is that option. But with the country, we're stuck. We are stuck in this unhealthy relationship, and it can be frightening because there's a sense of disempowerment in these sorts of relationships, again, fear provoking. It's bad enough to be in a threatening relationship, but if you can't leave and you're disempowered and helpless, that is going to trigger fear in anybody. I mean, that's a very natural human reaction. And I think that's what we're experiencing as a country and as individuals, is this sense of disbelief and fear and disempowerment.
That's a fascinating way of looking at it. Actually, a great paradigm is that we're in an abusive relationship we can't escape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I write about in the chapter a little bit, is that sense that we can't, do much about this, and especially when we look at, the slow moving investigations and the lack of congressional action, we think is our system going to save us from this? And, who knows at this point? So it's distressing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I hesitate to say this, but it does give us some empathy for the shooter at the White House Republican baseball practice. That if people really feel like that there is no political solution to an unacceptable abusive relationship, I guess people have gotten off for murdering abusive partners. So you could see his act in that light.
Right, and that you're exactly right. There's a sense of frustration. In fact, I had a client the other day, just a couple days ago, who we've talked about the political situation a little bit. He is a liberal and is very concerned, and he went from being sort of anxious and distressed to, he said, I'm sort of dysfunctionally helpless. I'm giving up. I've given up. He doesn't know what to do.
Which is another response.
There's sort of this passive, like, I'm helpless, but other people may go the other way and take action and take it into their own hands. Unfortunately, in very harmful way. But you can, right, you can see, and I'm sure that's what people feel on the other end of the spectrum when they lash out and shoot people, is they feel like maybe they are hopeless and hopeless too. I don't know. It's never a good response. Obviously, violence is never helpful, and we see that in abusive relationships. Clearly, the violence merely causes the relationship to end and disintegrate in very unhealthy ways.
So people are sort of trapped with no good response. They can become depressed, like your friend. They can become violent, which we agree is not the right response, or they can dissociate, as Betty Tang talked about. But in essence, it is a crazy-making situation to be trapped in a relationship with a powerful, abusive partner. And so we are really all victims.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Of mass domestic violence.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this sense of the crazy making part is a very difficult part of an abusive relationship, that sort of gaslighting that people talk about, this sense of unreality, that the lies are so crazy making, you don't know what you start to not know what to believe. And I see this in abusive relationships. People will come in and they talk about their spouse, who's maybe just emotionally abusive, but they'll talk about how he says these things and they just believe it. Like, that's just normal, right? I mean, of course you get angry because, dinner's not on the table on time or something. And you have to look at them and go, well, no, that's really not normal, whatever that is. But that's really not a normal response. And yet you start to just assume that that's what people do, right? Presidents just lie repeatedly about all kinds of things. That's just the way it is. There's a normalization to that is very crazy making, because then there's a loss of sense of self, a loss of sense of, what do I believe? What is real? What is the real story here? When the lies are just perpetrated over and over again. And that is very common in abusive relationships, the sense of unreality, the sense of crazy making or gaslighting that goes on.
And that's one of the things that people feel we really need to resist, is the normalization of Donald Trump. This is what Robert J. Lifton talked about at Yale when he used this term malignant normality, when the sort of pathology of a malignant leader starts to become the norm for a society and shifts the sense of reality for the entire population. That there really is that kind of attempt at brainwashing that's succeeding for a certain portion of the population, who still thinks the Russia investigation is a witch hunt, because they're drinking the Kool-Aid, they're listening to his Twitter feed and all of the things that are supporting it, all the new right, the alt-right, Fox News, narrative. But what's really sort of scary is how fragile our sense of reality is. And maybe we see this in a microcosm with an abused spouse, how a person's sense of self and their correct assessment of reality can become so easily compromised. We don't realize how fragile our sense of self and reality is.
It's very true. I can, again, speak to that personally, because I always thought I was fairly confident and had a good grasp of reality. And yet when you're in an abusive relationship, it starts to chip away very subtly. And they're very expert at that as well, starting to slowly get you to question your own beliefs and your own sense of self, so that you're left in this vacuum of reality. And we see that again on a national level, and we see it in like long-standing intergenerational abusive families, where there's this sort of sociopathic narcissistic pattern in multiple people in the family, where the whole family has this sense of unreality. Well, of course it's okay to hit your kids with a belt buckle, right? Of course that's okay. That's what everyone does. And that just assumption of normal, quote unquote, behavior is just part of their culture, part of that family culture, even though it's deeply obviously harmful.
So what makes you feel, as a mental health professional specifically, that you have a duty to warn the general public?
Yeah, I just got in a little, discussion on my professional Facebook page about this with another counselor, who believes that she believes there's a duty to protect the Trump voter, that they should not be challenged about their assumptions about Trump. And I said, I believe that I have a duty to protect those who are victimized, who have been abused, who have been in these unhealthy abusive relationships of various types, whether it's just emotional abuse as a child or physical and emotional abuse as an adult, or just a very unhealthy, toxic a relationship, I have a duty to protect those people as well who've been victimized by Trump on this sort of individual level. But certainly as a country, again, I think we are in relationship with an abusive president, and I think there's a need to speak up to not allow that normalization of his behavior to happen. And I very strongly believe in that.
So based on that analysis, you should file a report with Protective Services.
Perhaps. Perhaps.
All right, well, get to work on that. And in the meantime, thank you very much for talking to us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, nice
Thank
talking
you.
to you. Bye-bye.